What's happening, model makers? I hope everything is going well at your workbenches. It's definitely been going smooth at mine, and I've been making lots of progress on all of my projects, but especially on the Dragon bf-109 project. If you've been keeping up with that, you know that where I left off on the last video segment was in basically having the nose and engine section all completed. And so with this installment, what we're going to do is wrap that up, take a look at where that all finally settled out, and then move into the next portion of the instruction sheet that gets us into building wings, tailplane, and control surfaces. And so if you've been waiting for that, that is what's on deck. It'll take us about an hour to get through all that, but I think you'll see some things in there that are pretty valuable to know if you are serious about building this kit. Okay, let's take a look. Okay, before we move on to the next section, let's have a little follow-up on what I was doing in the last episode. As I showed you, I was doing some crazy manipulations to get the chin piece of the cowling to fit on the engine, and I did in fact get that done, but I had a few complications that I thought I should tell you about, and you will obviously notice that everything is painted up. I swear I was walking along and I tripped and fell, and this landed in a bucket of paint. And when I pulled it out, it even had some extra details attached to it. At least that's what I'm telling Jim Starkweather. At any rate, here's what I had to do to get my one-piece chin on this thing. I actually noticed, and you may have noticed when you were watching the other episode, because that's when I saw it, that when I thought I had it slid all the way on, there was still a gap of about 100,000ths of an inch between the front edge of this radiator louver and the back edge of the opening right here in the cowling. And so I knew that I didn't have it slid all the way on. And so I had to go back and rework that. And I discovered, because I decided to do that after I had already painted the exhausts and gotten them all glued in place and everything was really solid, I discovered that with everything really solid, that it was a little tougher to slide that chin piece off and on there than it was in my demonstration at the end of the last episode. So what I ended up doing was having to take a little material here and there to get it done. The main place was that I had to take a little material off the bottom of this tank right here. I also made sure that this cowl piece was a little thinner right there. But the most important thing, and I think this may have been the major culprit in all of it, was that there's a couple of tabs in the inside of this cowling, right here and right here on the other side, that are supposed to mate with notches on the sides of this tank. And they, I think, may be too tall, and I ended up just removing them completely. And honestly, if I were going to go back and do this over again, I might find that if I just took those tabs off to begin with, that everything would have gone together, with joining these as two separate halves on the engine assembly itself, rather than creating a single part and then putting it on afterwards. Hopefully that makes sense. At any rate, I also took a little material off of the back edge of this radiator louver here. And when I did all that, it all slid right into place, almost as if it was made to happen that way. And as you can see, I've got the inlet to the supercharger joined up where it's supposed to be. The exhausts are poking through the sides of the cowling the way that they're supposed to, and everything looks pretty shipshape. So it was a challenge, but I feel like everything turned out fine. Now, if I were going to go back and do this over again, would I do it the same way? Maybe, maybe not. I mean, there's trade-offs with everything. But I think that knowing what I know now about those two protrusions that are on the insides of the cowl right here and how they affected things, that what I might try is having the exhausts, and everything painted up, and then assemble the two halves of the chin from the sides, like that. Oops, stay put there. Assembling the two halves of the cowling this way, and then dealing with the seam afterwards. Now, obviously, that would mean doing all of the priming and painting on this cowl piece after installing it, and that's okay. That's not impossible, but it does mean that you have to mask off the exhausts. Either way you tackle this, there's going to be trade-offs, and you just have to figure out what strategy suits you the best. This turned out fine for me, but I'm not saying that it's the only way to do it. What I do feel, however, pretty certain of, and this is even also after talking with another guy who has built this kit, that if you attempt to assemble this the way that they show in the instructions, that you're going to have problems. There's just too many tolerances, too many things going on here that have to end up in the right place for it to, for you to rely on getting the exhaust glued to the cowling in exactly the right way, such that everything joins together after the fact and ends up in the right spot. So that's the only thing that I feel certain of, is that I would not do it the way that Dragon shows you how to do it. Now, I want to make a point here. Somebody asked me if I felt like Dragon had not done their test fitting. I don't think that's the case. I'm certainly not ready to accuse them of that. I don't think that they could have gotten this kit as good as it is, and it is really good, without doing all of their due diligence. So, no, I don't think that's the situation. What I think is that it was just a matter of compromises. There's, a dozen different ways that they could have done this, and, from a tooling standpoint, a cost standpoint, and from an assembly standpoint, they just had to pick one of those ways and go with it. So it is what it is. I will only, really kind of harsh on them for the way the instructions are written. But hey, that's why we do these videos, right? Okay, so as promised, we are fully into the section of the instruction sheet where we're going to build up the wing subassemblies. And I've gone ahead and done steps 8 through 9 and gotten one of the wings completed. And there's a couple of things that I think are worth talking about right off the bat before we get into the actual build process that it takes to get there. This is the result that you end up with if you follow the instructions exactly. You get a subassembly with a movable slat here on the front, and there's a little bit of a trick to making sure that that works because of some lack of clarity in the instructions, but that comes out pretty good. And then you get movable ailerons, both up and down, and then also obviously movable flaps. So those look pretty good, and I'm pretty happy with the results there. I've also done one of the landing gear assemblies, and there's some things to talk about that as well. So let's go ahead and get started with the actual construction on the opposite wing. Okay, first things first is right here. You will notice on step 10 that one of the things they want you to go ahead and assemble is this counterweight. Now, I think for reasons that are obvious to everybody, I'm not going to do that yet because that's just begging to be snapped off as we go further down the road. So those will go in the little stash of parts to be added later. And I did the same thing when it came to the other wing here in step 9, where they want you to put on the pitot tube. There's a small photo etch part that goes right here. And then also in step 8, they've got one of the counterweights on that side as well. So, you know, do what you want to do, but my view is that there's no reason to take silly chances with parts getting broken off. And so those are the kind of things that I will save until pretty much everything is completely assembled, possibly even clear up until after paint is done. So what we are going to do then is this first steps here of assembling the photo etch for the hinges on the aileron and gluing these small hinge lugs on these two spots right here. Okay, now that I've gotten those two lugs glued in place, I want to point out something that might be good to be aware of. If you clip all 4 of these lugs off of the sprue before you do any assembly work, you've got to be careful not to get them mixed up, because as you can see, they do have an orientation and they are molded differently. And the reason is because the photo etch parts that go in there have to fit in a certain way. So just make sure that you're putting the correct one on the correct aileron and the correct flap portion. Okay, I'm about to start on the photo etch, but before I do that, because I want to have some glue drying while I work on something else, I'm going to turn my attention to this portion of the landing gear wheel well that needs some parts added to it. Okay, the first part is pretty straightforward. That's just this tunnel for the strut. And it drops in there nicely without any complaints, and you don't really even have to do any cleanup of sprue gates or anything like that. Now, the next thing is this flexible part here. And I wasn't honestly sure that it was going to behave with Tamiya extra thin, but it turns out that it does just fine. But because it's flexible, it's not the exact perfect shape that it's supposed to be. So what I recommend is taking a kind of a gradual approach and gluing down one section of it at a time, because it needs to fit in the cutout that's there for the edge of it to recess down into. So what I'm doing is just getting this side of it stuck down first, and once I know that's good, which happens pretty fast, then I will just kind of work my way around the other sides of it. And if you do that, I think you'll find that it conforms to the correct shape pretty easily. In fact, this one is doing it even more easily than the one on the other wing did. It took 3 or 4 steps to get it all snug and happy, but there you go. That's all it takes to get that in there correctly. So we'll set that aside for a little bit, and this is probably as good a time as any to tackle the slat on the front. Now, let's take a look at the instruction sheet here for a second. And I'm going to just use this this portion that I've already done, because they're the same on both sides. They don't really tell you a whole lot about exactly how this part here is supposed to mate up against the backside of the slat itself. But it is actually very important, and you'll see why here in a second. It's pretty easy when you are putting it together to want it to just lay down flush against the inside of the slat, but that is a bad thing, as you'll see here in just a second. So let me get this thing sort of tacked in place, and I'll show you what I mean. Okay, so you can see that what happens is that it naturally just wants to lay flush against the underside of the slat. And especially if you're using Tamiya extra thin, it's going to very quickly become permanently in that orientation, as it did for me when I was building the other wing. The good news is that if you leave it that way and then find out, as I did, that it can't be like that, that you can use a little Tamiya extra thin to reactivate the joint and correct the problem. And the problem is that if you look at this, the framework on this back side of the slat has to protrude through these notches right here, and the back side of the slat has to lay up against this recessed portion of the leading edge. And if you've glued it together flush like that, hopefully that'll focus, then you've got a mutually exclusive condition. Those two things can't happen. So what I recommend you do is get it where it's tacked in here like this, but the joint is still active, and then take and just basically wedge the leading edge of the wing underneath it. Just kind of shove it in there like that, okay? And then push that little framework down to where it mates up against these parts right here. But unless you want the flats to be unless you want the slats to be stationary, don't put any more glue in there, because obviously if you put any glue in here, the slat's not going to be able to move in and out when everything is all said and done. But if you do that and allow things to just settle down like that, then you'll get a slat that will seat correctly in the recess. Except for one small thing that I've already noticed, and that is that there's some warpage on this part. You should be able to see that right here, where if you'll notice, the gap at each end of the slat is not uniform. So you're going to have to kind of deal with that. If you choose to make the slats closed, then it's not a big deal, because you can just glue down one end of it and get that all secure, and then come along and force the other end of it into place and close that gap up, and that should be no problem. I'm choosing to leave the slats mobile, so to speak, because my ultimate intent for this aircraft will be that the slats will be extended, so that slight warpage is not going to be a problem. Alright, so we'll set that aside, and now we will get to, oh look, wait, here's another thing that we can do to procrastinate starting on the photo etch. Actually, a couple of more things. This is just the little two halves of the radiator, and it won't hurt to have them taken care of. provided I can actually get a grip on them. Alright, there we go. It's always the parts that seem the simplest that I end up wrestling with the most. Now, here's another one that's pretty low-hanging fruit, and that's this cover for the cannon bay. And that part, well, if you get it oriented correctly, anyway, it is narrower at the back. But if you get it oriented correctly, it should, I say it should, just drop right into place, and it's biting me a little bit. The other one did not. The other one basically just fell right in there. But I bet a little bit of extra thin persuasion will make things happen. Yeah, and that's all it took. Sometimes, you know, a little extra thin will basically act like a lubricant because it melts the parts just enough that it'll allow them to fit together. But you notice that I pressed on it with the edge of the tweezers because I've got a lot of extra thin floating around there, and I don't want to mash a great big thumbprint right into the middle of that cover. But you can see now that's all in place. And we might as well flip it over and install the cannon. Now, there's actually a couple of other parts to the cannon. These two pieces right here that represent the ammunition drum. But unless you are going to unless you're going to have the cover off of the weapons bay and somehow have the underside of the aircraft invisible, that ammunition drum is not going to be seen by anybody, and they are nice little parts to add to my extras box. So yes, I'm cheating a little bit by not installing them, but obviously we do need this beautifully detailed cannon to be poking out of the front side of the wing, so we're going to go ahead and get that in place. So basically everything is going to be done and secure so that when we get the next step taken care of, we'll be basically ready to assemble the wing halves. Okay, so now we're going to have to start the photo etch, and this isn't too bad, but there's definitely a trick to getting this done. And the first thing I'm going to do is go off camera and clip these little parts off of the fret. Okay, actually I decided to talk about these parts before I clip them off. So let's look at them in the instruction sheet here for a second. Okay, what we're dealing with here is this little group of 5 photo etch parts and 1 plastic part that I'm going to show you. And you can see that this particular part, MA2, has to be bent into the shape of a clevis. So let's look at the actual parts because they are extremely tiny. And there's a couple of things to say about them before I even clip them off the fret. Okay, so this part number MA16. Oops, kind of not in the frame there. Okay, this part right here, number MA16 and MA15 in particular. Let me say something about those, but I'm going to just try and zoom the camera way in there. And talk about them with the tip of my knife rather than trying to hold them. Okay, so this is part number MA16, ep64 right here. And you can see it's a little bitty dude. Be very careful when you're clipping these things off. If you'll notice, part number MA15 right here, there should be one, and there's not. And that's because I wasn't paying attention when I clipped it off of the fret while I was doing the first wing half, and I lost it. I will say, Dragon, that it would be great if you guys would include maybe an extra for each of these little bitty tiny parts, because that's just the kind of thing that's going to happen. You can see there's a couple more of them right here, and there's really no extra cost for you guys to include extras, and it's a real nice bonus that shows that you're, you know, sort of understanding the process and thinking of thinking of your customers. So maybe someday you guys can modify this fret and do that. But let me talk about what these parts do and what I'm going to have to do to resolve the problem. This part right here, MA16, goes on to the aileron. And let me show you where. Get rid of the instruction sheet here, get it out of the way. Okay, it fits into this recess that I showed you before, right there. Now you can see that what they're suggesting you do is that you assemble the pin, which I don't have anymore, and that female part onto the hinge itself. That doesn't work all that well for a couple of reasons. This part 16 goes on the flap. Is that correct? Yeah, it goes on the flap, and this part MA15 recesses into this notch on the lug that we glued to the aileron and that you can see right there. And what's going to happen is, okay, we might as well just go ahead and talk about this whole issue here. What's going to happen is that if you look right here, you're going to supposedly join all three of these sub-assemblies when you attach everything to the trailing edge of the wing sub-assembly. But it doesn't quite work out like that, and for this main reason. This part right here, the flap, if you look at this, you should be wondering, like I was, where the heck the inner hinge point is and how it's going to stay attached to the rest of this as you go down the road, when the only thing holding it there is the tiny little metal part number MA16 that's glued to the inside of this lug. And the answer is it won't. And you have to search a little further ahead in the instructions to figure out what the deal is, because it's almost like they just forgot that you were going to need an inner hinge point for the landing flap, but it is in fact there. But for some reason, it's not included until you get all the way over here to step 13 and step 14, where you're actually attaching the wings to the fuselage, that they show you that you've got another little photo etch subassembly that creates the inner hinge of for the landing flap. So this is definitely a point where you've got to go off the instruction sheet and do as I did on this wing section. And I'm going to show you that, where you've got to go ahead and build the photo etch hinge for this inner location and attach it to the flap, and then put that subassembly together with the rest of the wing. So I feel like I'm not doing a very good job of explaining it, but hopefully it'll all become clear here in a few minutes. And you'll see what I'm going to do to solve the fact that I lost the hinge pin that goes between the aileron and the flap. Now, one more thing to talk about real quickly before I clip those parts off. I almost forgot, and that is, okay, right here. When you put this hinge assembly together for the outer hinge, outer aileron hinge, you'll see that one of them is a plastic part, this part number C37. And let me show you what you're dealing with there. Okay, and I've left it attached to the sprue for this exact reason. Okay, there it is, part number 37. And as you can see, it is extremely tiny. Actually, it's part number 38 on this wing section. But you can see it is just very, very tiny. And there's two of them. And that's because you need one for the outer aileron hinge and one for the inner flap hinge. So I recommend not clipping those off of the sprue until the very moment that you need them, because obviously those tiny little things will get swallowed by the carpet monster in a split second. Okay, first things first with this photo etch. We have to form up the two clevises for the hinge points. Now, a lot of people say that you've got to have one of those fancy bending tools for photo etch, and I think if you build armor a lot that they probably are pretty handy. But for little pieces like this, I would argue that you don't really need one, and especially if they're like these, where they've got the bending points etched into them to make things easy. They will almost form themselves. And I'm going to show you, or attempt to show you here on camera, how I do that. Hopefully you'll be able to get a decent enough view of it. But basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to just hold the thing down as close to the crease line as I can with this flat blade, and then just reach underneath the part that gets folded up with another blade, and just like that, just eyeball a nice 90-degree bend on it, and there you go. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Now the other side is a little trickier because you've already got half of it standing up there, but you just have to get your blade down there as a holder and just very carefully pick up that tab and fold it up into place. And if you don't get it all the way, then you can always just lay it over on its side like that and just put a little pressure on it to fold each side of it a little closer together. And there you go. That is a nice clean little bend, and hopefully it's kind of ridiculous to try and actually look at this stuff on camera, but I'll show them to you here in a second after I bend up the other piece. Okay, there you go. You can see that one right there is nicely bent into the appropriate clevis shape, and the other one over here is ready to go as well. So let me readjust the camera and I'll show you the next step. Okay, now the next part involves putting the other half of the hinge in place and putting the little plastic pin through it. And what I found in doing the first half of the wing assembly is that the smoothest way to do it is to get your clevis piece into an upright position in the correct orientation. So what I've done there is I've stuck it, and it's hard to see, but it's right there, and I've stuck it vertically into that blob of blue tack. And what I'm going to do now is take this piece, you can see the hole there, and I'm going to just set it in there in the clevis. Hopefully with the holes lined up. And then I'm going to go over here and get one of these pins. Now, I've got the pin here in my tweezers. Very difficult to see, and if you can't see it, you're just going to have to trust me when I say it's in there. Okay, so what I've done is I've inserted the pin from the side there. Took me a couple of tries, but it is at least loosely in place to where now I can go ahead and push it the rest of the way through. Alright, now that I've got it all the way through the clevis and the hinge, I'm going to get a little tiny bit of super glue on a piece of wire, which is how I apply little tiny bits of super glue most often. I need to clip the end of the wire off. Should have done this beforehand, but hey, that's how it goes sometimes. So get the end of the wire clipped off, and we'll take just a very small amount of super glue, because obviously you don't want to get any in the wrong place and foul the hinge. So, and it doesn't take much to hold that pin in there, so that's all you need. Alright, and basically now I'm going to repeat that process with the other hinge sub-assembly that goes on the inner point of the landing flap. Okay, so I've got the flap here, and I've gone ahead and inserted the photo etch part number M15 in the end of it. You can see right there, hopefully that'll focus in the right spot. But as I was saying, we have a little bit of a problem in that I lost the hinge pin that is supposed to go in that slot right there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of 13 thousandths stainless wire off of this roll right here, which is the perfect size for a hinge pin, as I double checked there. And I'm going to just dip the end of it in some super glue, and I'm going to insert it into the middle of that slot and let it stick straight out from there. Get it appropriately positioned. And this doesn't have to be just super duper precise, because there's some slop in these pieces, but I think you can see that is in about the right spot. And obviously what I'm going to do is clip that off to the right length after we're certain that the super glue is all cured. And I'm going to put a little bit more on there just to make sure it's plenty strong enough. Although, for reasons that I'll explain later, that is actually a bit of overkill, and you are probably already way ahead of me on the reasons why. But in the meantime, while that's setting up, we have a little bit of work to do, and that involves placing these parts. And I'm going to change the camera view and switch over to the instructions so I can show you a place where it's important to do it differently than what they show you. So hold on a minute here, let me give you a little bit of a view of my workbench while I get things rearranged. I normally turn the camera off to do this, but hey, why not? Alright, so here we go, instruction sheet. If you look right here, they are telling you to attach the hinge pieces to the upper section of the wing, and the aileron and the flap along with it. Now there's two things about that don't really work, and I'll show you the major one right now. The upper half of the wing is right here, and if you look at the place where the hinges go, you've just got this flat spot. There's nothing really there to locate the photo etch pieces. But if you look at the lower half of the wing, you can see that you've got some slots right there that those photo etch pieces will just drop right into. So we're going to attach to the lower half of the wing, but before we do that, we are going to attach the hinge pieces to the aileron and the flap, and then bring that to the wing as a subassembly. But before we do that, we need to assemble the two halves of the aileron, which I really should have done earlier. Okay, we'll let that set up for a second, and in the meantime, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the photo etch hinge assembly on the landing flap. And you can see that right there next to that bulge and by my thumbnail is a little slot, and that is where the clevis end of the hinge assembly goes. So we're just gonna drop a nice little spot of super glue in there, a little too big of a spot. Okay, the hinge that goes in that spot is this one right here. And so we'll just take and drop it right in there. And I've found that these bits are quite well engineered. The slots that these hinge pieces go into are perfectly sized, and everything fits very well. So you can see that we've now got a lovely inner hinge point for the landing flap, and we'll now do the same for the aileron, and you can see where the hinge goes on this one. Again, right there next to my thumbnail. Okay, and again, it drops into place very nicely. And it's important to note that of all of these, this one is the only one that's going to show. Now, before we get ready to move on to the next step, we obviously need to trim off this hinge pin. And so I'm going to just take my Xuron photo etch shears, which are one of my absolute favorite tools. If you do anything at all with photo etch, I highly recommend a set of these. And I'm going to clip that guy off. Pretty close. Just like that. And you can see how much I've left on there. It doesn't take much, but there you go. Nice clean little hinge pin. Okay, we are now ready to attach the aileron and the flap to the lower portion of the wing subassembly. And you kind of have to get yourself oriented because you're doing it basically the opposite of what it shows in the instructions. So just keep in mind that this is going to show on the outside. So we'll just set the aileron in there like that. And once we're satisfied that the tab on the hinge is in the right spot, then we can just go ahead and add a little bit of glue there. And then just press that down into the slot. Okay, confession time. As I was adding the aileron to the rest of the wing, I realized that something was not quite right, and that was that I had put the wrong hinge piece out here on the outer portion of the aileron hinge. I had put this one on here when in fact it should have been this one, which I still had attached to the photo etch sprue. Now, fortunately, because I didn't use a whole lot of glue, I was able to open the clevis up just enough to slip the other one out and replace it with this one, and so everything is as it should be, but that was a pretty close call. So don't do that. That's a bad move. Very embarrassing when you do things like that on camera. Wow, I don't know what I was thinking when I decided to do photo etch on camera. That's not something that I recommend. But nonetheless, it's done. And you can see that the hinge tabs, the correct hinge tabs now, are located in the right spot and have a nice little dab of super glue on them to hold them in place. And you can see how this one has got itself attached to the proper location on the aileron with the hinge pin that we made a few minutes ago. So we're in good shape now to go ahead and add the top half of the wing to this subassembly. So I'm gonna just go ahead and do that. Okay, so it's a few minutes later, thanks to the wonders of Tamiya Extra Thin. That didn't take too long, and the two halves of the wing are secure. And before we move on, there's a couple of things to talk about. Okay, first, regarding using Tamiya extra thin, a couple of things to say about that when you're using it in conjunction with movable parts. Right here in a place like this where you need a little bit of extra thin on that wingtip, you want to make sure and not get it into the aileron, because obviously then you could end up gluing the aileron in place, and you don't want that. Something else with extra thin is sometimes if you're like me and you're clumsy, you'll get a big blob of it, like you can see right there, on the outside of something. All you have to do when that happens is just very quickly, as soon as you see that that's happened, just go and just blow it, and it'll pretty much disappear. And it won't leave much, if any, of a mark. Certainly better than sticking your finger in it or trying to wipe it away. Okay, I've also gone ahead and added the radiator part here. And you can see that our slat is movable the way that it's supposed to be. So that's all good. Okay, so we've got the wings completely assembled, with the only exception being the cover that goes over the cannon port. And obviously, if you're going to paint the front of the cannon, you need to be able to get to that. So that part's got to wait until later. Now, after all of this, we have some lovely movable aileron and flap assemblies, which is pretty cool, but you knew there was going to be a but, right? I have to say that I think in large part that some of that is kind of a waste of time. I don't know about you, but I don't care to try and move my flaps or my ailerons later on after the build is finished. I mean, I'm not, running around the house with my little airplane making propeller and machine gun noises and moving my landing flaps up and down. I pick a position and I stick them that way, and that's what I'm going to do here, and I assume that most of you guys are going to do the same. So a lot of the care that I took in making sure that all of this stuff went together correctly was mostly to demonstrate that can be done given the instructions and the parts that you've got. So, the choice is up to you as to how much you actually want to make that happen. I personally am probably going to have the flaps stuck in a down position, and even if I didn't, you can see that there's not enough friction there for them to stay in any other position anyway without some glue. So I'm going to have the flaps in the down position, and I'm probably going to just leave the ailerons in the neutral position, which really is most of the time is going to be the correct thing. I mean, look, a word about ailerons, because I've seen a few builds where people put both ailerons in the down position. Unless they are on a modern aircraft that has flaperons, that's wrong. Don't do it. Ailerons, as a rule, are always going in opposite directions because they provide roll. So if the left one is up, the right one is down, and vice versa. It just has to be that way. And generally, when an aircraft is on the ground, the ailerons are going to be in the neutral position. So that is probably where I'm going to stick mine. All right, now that all of that is assembled, it was time to move on to the landing gear, and I went ahead and did that while I was off camera. And there's really not a whole lot to say here, because this just goes together so well. I generally despise landing gear, and one of the reasons why is because normally you have to pre-paint everything and then glue it together, and it involves super glue and handling painted parts, and that just has a high potential for disaster. But I think that you could make the argument with this bf-109 gear that you could assemble at least this much of it, and by this much I mean the strut, this little piece right here, the torsion link, and the brake line and the door. Because if you paint every bit of this in RLM02, you're not wrong, especially since it's molded with the socks on the lower portion of the strut. So I think in this case that's a legitimate way to go about it if you want to do that. Obviously, you want to wait until you've painted the wheel to put it on, because you're not going to be able to get to the rest of it if the wheel's already on there. Speaking of the wheels, these are, a little bit of a disappointment. They are in 2 halves, and as always with wheels that are in 2 halves, you're going to have that seam line to deal with, and these don't actually line up very well. So the tread pattern doesn't match all that great even without the seam line. So I think that anybody that's really serious about their wheels like I am is probably going to go for an aftermarket resin wheel anyway, which is kind of a shame, because these are pretty nicely molded. The detail on them is great, and even though they're not weighted, they are hollow, and it's relatively easy to turn a hollow wheel into a weighted wheel by just heating it up a little bit and mashing it against a flat surface, and that gives you a realistic pooch as opposed to just sanding the bottom of it flat, which is a totally different thing. So it's kind of a bummer, but it is what it is. I personally, for the $10 that a set of aftermarket resin wheels will cost me, feel like that's a real easy trade to not have to mess with that seam line. Although, these tires do get worn down, and you wouldn't be wrong if you sanded it down enough to make the seam line and some of the tread disappear. So that's not a huge deal. But as it turns out, I'm not going to be using either of the wheels or the landing gear anyway, because I've decided a long time ago that my plan for this project is that it's going to be a crash diorama. And so this little bird is going to be sitting on its belly in the grass, and I will therefore avoid any and all issues with the landing gear, which I love. So no worries for me on that score. But I do have to say that it's a little bit of a shame, because these are really probably the nicest landing gear I've ever seen in an aircraft kit so far. And that includes Tamiya landing gear. These are really good. The only thing about it that I don't like, and you can see this now that I've glued the wheel on, if you can get the right angle, is that brake hose does not quite extend far enough to touch up against the side of the wheel the way it should. And I actually think that the alignment mark on the wheel is in the wrong place, because I believe that the brake hose should mate with that hole right there. So it's altogether wrong. If that really bugs you, you're going to have to figure out a way to solve that problem as well. But it is fairly difficult to see, so you may not feel like that's necessary. So before I press on with permanently attaching the right wing, I thought I would show you kind of where I got to with trying to solve the problem of this gap. As you can see, the gap on the top part of the left wing is about the same as it was. It's a little bit better. I've got still a bit of a gap up here towards the front, but I think some Mr. Surfacer 1000 will take care of that. I did manage to get rid of most of the gap on the bottom side, so that's pretty good, but you can see that there's still a real significant step right there. Now, if I was serious about it, I would shave that down with a number 10 X-Acto blade and get that more or less level. Same thing back here at this joint, where you've got a similar problem. Now, for the right wing, I've got that about as close as I'm going to get it, because keeping in mind that my ultimate intent with this project is that this is going to be a crash diorama, and it's going to be resting on its belly I really don't have to care about that gap on the bottom. And I'm about over messing with it. So as you can see, I've got the top portion pretty well squared away, and the bottom, when I apply some pressure, closes up fairly well. Now, how did I accomplish that? Let me pull this off here. On the left wing, I did it all by shaving material off of this surface right here, which was a real pain in the ass, and it's a situation where a nice sharp flat file is definitely the right tool. Don't try to use a sanding stick, because you want something that's perfectly rigid so that you can maintain a planar surface across there and not screw up that joint. But on the right wing, the gap was a lot worse, and I also wanted to try a different approach. So what I also did, how I accomplished most of it, was I took some material off the tops of these two spars, and also shaved a little bit of material off of this surface right here. So that would allow the wing to droop a little bit, and hopefully close up some of the gap along this bottom edge. And now obviously that would screw up the dihedral a little bit, but again, since this one's going to be resting on its belly, I don't care about that. And if it wasn't, then I would have done the same thing to both sides, I think, and just to make sure that I had at least an equal dihedral on both wings. So that got most of it closed up. I did end up taking a little bit of material off of this edge with my flat file, but that's hard work. I didn't really want to screw with it too much, so that's where I'm at with that, and I'm now going to go ahead and glue this wing on permanently. Okay, so there you have it. That gets us through another substantial chunk of work on the Dragon 132nd bf-109-e4. We've got some wings and some tail feathers and some other things all put together, and now we can move on to adding those things to the fuselage. And that's where we'll get started with the next segment. So, stay tuned.